Thomas had returned to this place many times over the years, as if drawn by a memory that refused to fade. Then, from the brittle brush, a full-grown bobcat silently emerged and walked straight toward him. Thomas froze not out of fear, but out of pure astonishment. The animal stood tall, its golden coat patterned with faint dark markings, its ears upright with black tufts twitching in the morning breeze. Most wild bobcats would vanish the instant they caught a trace of human scent. But this one was different. It locked eyes with Thomas and continued forward, calm, steady, carrying an unsettling curiosity. As the distance closed, he saw its gaze soften, its body language shift. There was something both strange and achingly familiar in every movement. The distinctive tilt of its head, the slight outward roll of its right front paw, the nearly invisible limp. And then, in an unimaginable act, the magnificent creature pressed its head against his shoulder, releasing a deep, resonant purr that vibrated through his chest. That moment flung open the doors of memory, pulling Thomas back 8 years to the day he saved a fragile bobcat kitten from a raging flood. What could make a wild soul return, carrying the marks of its past, to bond with a human this way? If you're an animal lover like me, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss any of our new stories. Of all the qualities a man might possess, perseverance was the one Thomas Hale took the most pride in. At 70, his face was a memoir, etched in flesh, sun-darkened, deeply lined, bearing the record of decades spent beneath wide skies and endless horizons. Every wrinkle was a memory of squinting into blazing dawns, every furrow an echo of quiet smiles at nature's fragile wonders. For over 40 years, he had been a wildlife photographer, a vocation that demanded stillness over action, waiting over pursuit. It was the art of erasing oneself into the landscape, of dissolving into the world until even the world itself forgot you were there. Thomas had honed that discipline in the knife-edged winds of the Rocky Mountains and in the heavy, suffocating humidity of the Louisiana swamps, all in pursuit of a fleeting instant immortalized through his lens. And now, beneath the soft dawn light spilling across the wild grasslands of New Mexico, his life's journey had led him back to a place that held a fragment of his soul. For the past 8 years, he had returned here in silence, each visit a wordless commemoration. To Thomas, this landscape was more than earth and sky. It was a living character in the story of his life, as familiar as an old friend, and unwilling ever to leave his memory. He knew by heart the way morning light poured over the mesas stretching to the horizon, turning them from a hazy purple into a blaze that seemed to set the entire sky on fire. He knew the wary, fleeting dash of wild turkeys through dry grass, and the slow, regal spirals of red-tailed hawks riding the desert's rising thermals. It was an existence at once magnificent and lonely, a loneliness that had only deepened since the passing of his wife, Margaret, a silent wound that the harsh wilderness could soothe, but never truly heal. He braced a knee to the ground, joints creaking their reminder of age, and slowly adjusted his tripod. The camera, sleek and black, as if fused to his very sight, was trained on a distant ridge. He was framing a wide shot, hoping to capture the essence of this sun-seared land, a place where beauty was bound to brutality, where even silence carried the weight of time. But just as he pressed his eye to the viewfinder, a flicker of movement at the edge of the frame shattered his focus. He lowered the camera, his body stilled. From a thicket of brittle brush, a full-grown bobcat emerged, its stride slow yet commanding, its amber gaze locked onto him as though the entire desert had funneled its life force into this single encounter. Thomas froze, but not from fear. It was a reflex born of pure, unfiltered awe. Before him stood a flawless specimen, powerful muscles rippling beneath a golden coat, marked with dark, intricate patterns, as if carved by nature's patient hand. Its ears stood tall, tipped with sharp black tufts that twitched in the morning breeze, like antennae searching for unseen signals. Its short, stubby tail, a mere punctuation mark, only emphasized a body built to melt into the terrain and strike with silent precision. Ordinarily, a wild bobcat, especially one of this size and maturity, would have detected a human from hundreds of yards away and vanished like smoke on the wind. They were masters of disappearance, dissolving into rock and brush until the witness was left to wonder, had it truly been there at all, or just a trick of the eye? But this animal was different. It did not retreat. Its blazing amber eyes locked onto Thomas, and with slow, deliberate steps, it began to move toward him. His heart pounded heavy in his chest, echoing like a distant drum. Every instinct honed over 4 decades in the wild screamed in his mind. Stay still. Make yourself small. Appear utterly harmless. He was nothing more than a visitor in this creature's kingdom. And yet, as the bobcat closed the distance, a strange calm began to seep in, pushing back the rush of adrenaline. There was no aggression in its gait, no trace of fear in its eyes, only a quiet curiosity, edged with something primal and unnerving. The distance shrank to 20 yards, then 10. The bobcat did not slow. Thomas could now see each stiff whisker along its muzzle, the faint scar running just above its left eye, and then he noticed something else, a fragile detail, like a shard of memory, rushing back from afar. It moved with a slight hitch in its right front paw, a subtle roll in its step, almost imperceptible, yet bearing the mark of an old, long-healed injury. And the way it tilted its head, the thoughtful curiosity glowing in its eyes, it was all too familiar. So familiar, it made Thomas's chest tighten. The animal stopped, just a few feet away, close enough for him to hear the soft, steady breath rising from its chest. Its gaze shifted. What had begun as scrutiny and caution softened into something else, a quiet glimmer of recognition. Then the bobcat did something extraordinary. An act that shattered every law of nature Thomas had spent his life documenting, dissolving the boundary between observer and subject. It took one final step forward, pressed its head against his shoulder. A deep, resonant purr rumbled from its chest, vibrating through Thomas's bones like a bridge across the gulf of time. That touch, that sound, that familiar tilt of the head. Together they turned like a key in a lock long rusted shut, one he hadn't known was there. In that instant, something inside him broke wide open. Memories came flooding back in a torrent, vivid, overwhelming, so fierce it stole his breath. The scent of rain soaking dry earth, the terror of a storm unleashed, and the weight of a small, trembling, rain-drenched body cradled in his arms. His heart didn't just skip a beat. It seemed to stop altogether, then thundered back to life, painful and resounding like a crack of thunder in his chest. "Whiskey," he whispered. The name drifted out like smoke from the past, both a question and a plea. The floodgates of memory burst wide open. 8 years ago, in this very place, he had been stalking a shot of the desert's elusive monster, the Gila, locked in an uneven duel of patience between photographer and reptile. But the desert had chosen a different story for him. A tiny bobcat kitten, no bigger than a loaf of bread, strutting with more swagger than sense, had marched straight up to him without hesitation. Drawn by an instinct as old and tender as that of a grandfather, Thomas had held out a strip of beef jerky. A small act of kindness, but one that, unexpectedly, altered the course of his life. He gave the little bobcat a mischievous name, Rusty, and the very next morning, Rusty returned. But this time, he wasn't alone. He led a chaotic parade of 4 more kittens, tumbling, pouncing, rolling into one another, turning the sun-baked patch of desert into a wild circus stage. In an instant, Thomas, the stoic photographer who had lived a life steeped in silence, became Uncle Tom, the bewildered babysitter to a raucous brigade of bobcats. He came to know each of their personalities as intimately as if they were his own grandchildren. There was Rusty, the quiet leader, his eyes always thoughtful like a seasoned veteran. Luna, the sharp, sassy huntress, carrying herself as though the entire desert were her stage. Dash, the tiny, wiry whirlwind of pure energy, never still for more than a second. And their mother, Matilda, regal and commanding, presiding over the daily chaos from her throne, a sun-warmed slab of rock. And then there was Whiskey, sweet, clumsy, and always ruled by his stomach. He was the smallest of the litter, always a step behind his siblings, and usually the one to land himself in trouble. But Whiskey was also the most affectionate, the one who would gladly abandon the rough and tumble games just to curl up against Thomas's side. His deep, rumbling purr was a soothing balm, filling the lonely silence in the old man's heart. That memory now slammed back into Thomas with the force of a physical blow. The storm. The sky had turned a bruised, menacing purple, and then the world split open in a torrent of rain. In moments, a dry creek bed had become a raging, mud-choked river. And true to his slow ways, Whiskey had been caught swept away in the roaring current. Thomas heard Matilda's cries raw, piercing, the heartbreaking anguish of a mother that transcended species. In that instant, the prime directive of every wildlife documentarian, "Do not interfere," crumbled to dust. It was obliterated by a far older, far stronger law: protect your family. He plunged into the waist-deep, freezing torrent, the hidden undertow tearing at his legs, and fought his way toward the struggling bobcat kitten. He could still recall with bone-deep clarity the horror of his hand closing around Whiskey's tiny, sodden, limp body, and the paralyzing fear that he was too late. He dragged them both onto the muddy bank and collapsed, gasping, letting instinct take over. In sheer desperation, he began improvised CPR, something no field manual had ever prepared him for. He pressed his rough fingers gently against the kitten's fragile rib cage, then breathed a soft puff of air into its tiny nose. The memory of Whiskey's shuddering cough, the spray of water from his mouth, and that first ragged but undeniable breath, it all still echoed in Thomas's mind as vividly as the day it happened. He wrapped the trembling body in his heavy coat, and when he looked up, he found Matilda watching. In the mother's eyes there was no longer suspicion, but instead a profound gratitude, a language that needed no words. For 2 days, he nursed Whiskey back to health in his small wooden cabin, patiently feeding him thin chicken broth drop by drop from his fingertip. The tiny patient slept on a pillow beside his bed, his gentle breathing like the desert whispering in its sleep. The bond, forged in days of shared terror and mended with tender care, was something Thomas had never known before in his life. When he finally returned the healthy kitten to his family, Matilda brought him a gift, a freshly caught lizard, a silent but profound offering of thanks for what he had done. For the rest of that season, their strange, beautiful rhythm continued until the day the grasslands fell silent. He knew then they were gone, vanished forever, back into the wild. Tears streamed down Thomas's sun-weathered face, tracing long lines through the desert dust. He was back in the present, with the weight of the full-grown bobcat leaning firmly against him. That deep, steady purr was a living anchor, holding him fast to the past. He raised a trembling hand and slowly stroked the thick fur at Whiskey's neck. The bobcat did not flinch. Instead, he pressed closer into the touch, releasing a soft chuff from deep in his throat. Thomas exhaled a long breath, carrying with it a lifetime of silent grief and uncontainable wonder. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for his camera bag, each movement calm and measured. The bobcat watched him, amber eyes glowing with pure trust. Thomas's fingers fumbled past lenses and memory cards until they found a small vacuum-sealed pouch. He tore it open. Inside were freeze-dried rabbit treats, a small luxury he always carried into the field, just in case. It was the very same food that, years ago, had coaxed a fragile bobcat kitten out of its fear to eat again. He placed a piece in his open palm. Whiskey immediately lowered his head to sniff, the familiar scent striking some deep-buried memory. Then, with surprising gentleness, he accepted it, his rough tongue rasping across Thomas's skin. This was not a transaction of hunger. It was a ritual, a silent confirmation. Thomas laughed, the sound catching in his throat, wet but radiant with pure joy. "It really is you, you little knucklehead," he whispered. "You gave me one hell of a scare back then. A real scare, remember?" But the bobcat before him was no longer the clumsy, fragile kitten who once needed saving. He was now a full-grown sentinel of the wild, powerful and resilient, bearing the scars of a hard life carved into the wilderness. He was living proof of his mother's lessons and of his own extraordinary endurance. After that single treat, Whiskey didn't beg for more. Instead, he seemed to take stock, his gaze shifting toward the tripod and the camera Thomas had set up. With quiet, fluid grace, he padded closer and curled up beside the tripod's leg, tucking his paws neatly beneath his chest. He was not a pet seeking shelter. He was a companion choosing to settle in and share the watch with him. For the next hour, Thomas thought nothing of photography. He simply sat there on the dry, warm earth, the brim of his hat occasionally brushing against Whiskey's thick fur, surrendering himself to the pure reality of the moment. He watched the steady rise and fall of the bobcat's confident breath, the way his ears swiveled ever so slightly to catch the distant call of a canyon bird. The silence between them was not empty. It was full brimming with a shared history, a profound understanding that needed no words. At last, Thomas lifted his camera, but this time, he didn't point the lens toward the distant mesas. He turned it instead on the magnificent creature seated beside him. He recorded not with the detached eye of a documentarian, but with the warm gaze of a grandfather. The frame captured the sunlight, igniting the gold in Whiskey's coat, the quiet intelligence in his amber eyes, and even the almost imperceptible twitch of his tail. A quail rustled softly in a nearby creosote bush. Whiskey's head shot up, his body tightening, coiled with the compressed energy of a predator. His focus was absolute. For a fleeting moment, Thomas thought, "This is it." Instinct should have carried him away in a flash, leaving nothing but a striped shadow etched into memory. But instead, Whiskey slowly released the tension. He let out a soft sigh, lowered his head onto his front paws, and chose to stay. He glanced at Thomas, a look that seemed to whisper, "This matters more." And Thomas understood. This was the gift he had just been given. This was not dependence. Whiskey could hunt far better for himself than Thomas could ever provide. This was acknowledgement. It was a choice. A wild heart had chosen, for a few brief but priceless hours, to share its solitude with the only human it had ever trusted. He was standing guard, repaying an old debt not with servitude, but with the simplest and most powerful currency of all, his presence. They sat together as the sun climbed higher, two survivors sharing the same stretch of desert, grateful for a second chance, one that asked for nothing but mutual respect. The hollow ache that had long lived in Thomas's chest, a silent companion of recent years, was gone. It had been filled to overflowing by the rumble of a purr and the warmth of a wild body at his side. As the morning wore on and the desert heat began to build, Whiskey stirred. He rose with a fluid, powerful grace, stretching his muscular body beneath the searing sun. Then he looked straight at Thomas, amber eyes clear and unwavering, as if delivering a farewell that needed no words. It was time. He stepped forward and, for the final time, rubbed his head against Thomas's shin, a farewell spoken through touch, simple yet everlasting. Then, without a sound, he turned and slipped back into the brittle brush, vanishing as completely as if he had been only a dream. Thomas stood motionless for a long while, the imprint of Whiskey's presence still lingering in the air. He was alone again, but this time he was not lonely. Slowly, He packed up his camera, each movement steady and deliberate, as though closing the final steps of a ritual. His pilgrimage had reached its end, unexpected, miraculous. As he drove away, he glanced at the passenger seat where his camera bag lay. Inside it were memory cards, filled with the greatest story he had ever been part of. It wasn't the story of a rare animal captured from a distance. It was the story of a bond that had refused to be broken by time, by distance, or by the unwritten laws of the wild. It was the story of how a single, reckless act of love, the breaking of every rule to protect family, could echo through the years and return to you in the most unimaginable way. And in the quietest corners of a lonely man's soul, that was the very best kind of story there was.